I'm testifying at your Darlington hearing soon. What am I going to say? In Canada, your two major exports are wheat and uranium. You sell life and you sell death.
Those are not at all Canada's two biggest exports.
Chris, I know you through Decouple Podcast, and We Can Do It, your Canadian podcast. Introduce yourself. You make everyone else do that, so you can suffer now.
My name is Chris Kiefer. I'm an emergency physician based out of Toronto. Have a number of hats in my head now in terms of nuclear advocacy. I'm the director of Doctors for Nuclear Energy.
You mentioned kind of offhand having attended a Helen Caldicott talk. I think the most direct exposure I had was some people saying they didn't want to move to Seattle because of the radiation from Fukushima. When I hear that, I think immediately to the slide she has of half the people in Seattle would be killed by radiation, which was not created by Australian Radiation Services.
This is the nuclear fallout released by the Australian Radiation Service. And I've got a slide here, the fallout from Fukushima.
Garden variety internet hoax that I kind of thought a doctor would look at and be like, this is crazy town. But she showed it many times to audiences. But she wasn't going to show that to you because you saw her before Fukushima, right?
The early 2000s, the University of Guelph, she definitely did talk about nuclear energy. And at that time, nuclear energy wasn't on my radar. Most of my education on nuclear energy would have come from The Simpsons.
Up and atom.
Up and at them.
Up and atom.
Up and at them.
Up and atom.
Up and at them.
Some of the things she said were impactful. It was in War Memorial Hall at the University of Guelph. A lot of gravitas. I don't know if Helen was given one of her many honorary doctorates that night, but what I remember to this day is her saying nuclear energy was not a climate change fighting technology because of the embodied emissions within all of the concrete and steel.
Nuclear power produces a substantial amount of global warming gas.
Nuclear power produces massive quantities of global warming gas.
In fact, a nuclear power plant will produce the same amount of CO2 in toto as a gas-fired plant, so you may as well just use gas.
She went on at length about, how thick the containment was and how much concrete and steel would be used. She never provided any infographics or sourced literature to back up the claim. But it did stick in my head, and only within the last 2 or 3 years did I look at better evidence and see that that was a wholly untrue claim.
Who told you it was low carbon?
Probably it was Mark Linus, quoting the IPCC life cycle emissions.
And just to be clear, those are life cycle emissions. So when Helen Caldicott would say,
a nuclear power plant will produce the same amount of CO2 in toto as a gas-fired plant, so you may as well just use gas.
Life cycle emissions means that's all factored into these numbers.
It's easy and maybe to make the very minor mistake of saying that nuclear is emissions free. I mean, certainly at the point of production, when you're splitting those atoms and putting electricity on the grid, there's zero CO2 emissions occurring at that moment. There's no air pollution, but steel making is carbon intensive, concrete making is carbon intensive. That all contributes to that number. Making sure that we don't prematurely close our nuclear plants becomes really logical there. I mean, not in the way that Helen was imagining it, but if you have a nuclear plant and you only run it for 30 years, then the embodied emissions from the concrete and the steel may have you up at that 12 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But if you refurbish that plant, as we're doing in Canada with our CANDOs, and we go from 30 to 40 year lifespan to an 80 year lifespan, then we start getting to an incredibly low level. And really, it is the lowest carbon source we have, because you have to remember that wind and solar require some kind of a backup. Hopefully that's batteries, but batteries have a lot of embodied emissions in the mining, in the transportation, etc. So the life cycle emissions of nuclear, it truly to me is the lowest carbon source, because it's not an honest accounting of emissions to compare that to a source like wind and solar that are so intermittent that show up when they want to and harvest the weather rather than providing reliable power 24/7.
Well, my introduction to Caldicott was actually through thorium molten salt reactors, and she was characterizing them as a solid fuel reactor, the challenges you'd have with solid fuel.
In fluid form, you can get past a lot of the drawbacks of using thorium.
Any use in solid fuels, involves very difficult fuel processing.
First thing is that the fuel is in a liquid form. It means that the chemical processing is relatively easy to accomplish.
The expandability of the fluid gives you a large negative temperature coefficient.
Melting the fuel rods down in concentrated nitric acid from the thorium reactor, extracting 233, and then making more fuel rods with that and putting it in another reactor. It's economically totally out of the question.
I was like, no, this is liquid fuel. This is a different, maybe it's a different set of problems, but certainly a different set of solutions too. And I didn't realize that she had done Canada-wide tours, right? Like she's been scaring people in Alberta and Saskatchewan about nuclear power. And of course, uranium mining in Saskatchewan, right? Scare people about the waste, scare people about the fuel, every angle you can take to demonize nuclear power.
She's been highly, highly effective. I mean, and I can testify to that just in terms of my own opinions for a number of years. You know, and this is a woman who says that we should be fine to study by candlelight. Beethoven and Mozart created their great works by candlelight. So why do we need electricity? Why should children need lights to study at night?
Think about it. Mozart wrote by candlelight and so did Shakespeare. So the human race has lived for a very long time without electricity.
Mozart and Shakespeare wrote by candlelight. Ooh, candlelight? I'm writing an article for the International Herald Tribune now about the future of nuclear power, and I ended it by saying that and said, and the editor wrote back and said, well, you don't want to encourage people to think they have to go to candlelight again. Well, what's wrong with candlelight?
That's right. That's right.
We're so spoiled. Don't forget, Mozart wrote by candlelight. So did Shakespeare. We've lived and survived for 3 million years without electricity. There were some Eskimos, Inuits, and they had their normal life and they dried their fish and plaited the leather and hunted the polar bears and lived in their igloos. And then they got electricity. And then they got television. And then the young men and women left to go to a better life. And their life was destroyed. That's what I'm talking about. I was in China in '88. There wasn't a single car. There were millions of bicycles. There was one tall building in Beijing. And I said, if China goes the way of America and they all get refrigerators and cars, we've had it.
And this is the same woman who's crisscrossing the planet on, intercontinental flights.
We don't examine how we live. We don't examine how we eat. We don't examine that we don't walk upstairs, we go up in a thing. When you're in the plane, the hostess hands you a drink with a bloody bit of, tree beside it. I don't need that paper serviette. And I went to a sushi bar in New York recently. Everyone's in their best clothes drinking sakis, and I said, where are the fish from? They said, Japan. I got my sushi from New Zealand and Canada.
Yeah, this woman has a carbon footprint for sure. I mean, she has crisscrossed the globe. I really do try and, be a very compassionate person. And I think genuinely, when she was at a very impressionable young age, she was reading a book that had a very deep impact on her. These were scary times she was growing up in.
When I was about 16, I read a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute.
I remember it well.
And I lived in Melbourne, which is where the book was set.
Right.
So there's a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere which could occur tonight. And we all survived, but no one else did because we're so far south. And gradually the radiation came down. And then the government dispensed cyanide capsules to kill the babies so they'd die suddenly, not with the lingering effects of vomiting and bloody diarrhea. And then eventually everyone died. And the beautiful, elegant streets of Melbourne were still there with St George slaying the dragon outside the public library, and a blind was gently flapping in the breeze. And that was the end of life on Earth. I lost my virginity then. I never trusted anyone again.
It's just unfortunate. And I think we all need to do our best to expose ourselves to cognitive dissonance and constantly have our assumptions and our core beliefs challenged and to try and reckon with those in an honest way, because otherwise there's the potential to kind of get caught into these fossilized ways of seeing the world.
And a blind was gently flapping in the breeze. And that was the end of life on Earth. I lost my virginity then. I never trusted anyone again. I read everything I could find about nuclear weapons. I then did first year medicine, age 17, learned about Muller, who irradiated Drosophila fruit fly and produced genetic abnormalities passed on generation to generation. So I understood what radiation did. No dose is safe. You never need your teeth x-rayed, except if you've got an abscess. Don't get your breasts x-rayed every 2 years. No, they don't understand how radiation causes cancer. They don't know that each dose they receive causes cancer. Have pictures of fetal defects and deformed babies and all the rest. I mean, make it come home.
So the linear no threshold model basically states that there is no safe dose of radiation. In all other areas of toxicology, there are thresholds, and the dose makes the poison. If you jump off of a 100-foot cliff, it's probably going to kill you. But if you jump off of a 1-foot ledge 100 times, that's not going to kill you. I don't give much weight at all to very low doses having a relevant health impact. I don't believe that the linear no threshold is the best model to assess risk from low levels of radiation.
So I can't understand why the AMA, American Medical Association, the American Cancer Association, isn't saying close down the reactors.
Medicine has really changed fundamentally in how we make decisions about what is true or what's the reason that a treatment works or does it work or not work. And that used to be very much based on what was called a mechanistic worldview, which was, the heart is a pump, the valves function that same way, and you move blood like this. And so, or, on a molecular, there's a mechanism for this molecule to do this thing. And therefore, okay, it should work. The standard of evidence shifted to something called evidence-based medicine now, where we need to do large population-based studies, randomized, controlled, double-blinded, multi-center studies to actually prove something so we can get rid of all the potential biases that may be producing a falsely positive result or saying that a treatment does or doesn't work. And that really predates Caldicott's training. And she loves to bandy about, listen, like, I'm a pediatrician. I've worked in this field for this long. I'm the expert, real appeal to authority in a lot of her argumentation.
How dare anyone question our medical credentials? If I lied in medicine, I would be deregistered. If I lied in medicine, I would be deregistered.
And I'm not boasting, but I'm a very good doctorate. I came second in my year of medicine. I don't say things that are inaccurate. Otherwise, I would be deregistered. I mean, doctors can't lie.
Being a doctor trained in the 60s and 70s is very different than being a doctor trained now in terms of how we assess the evidence and the medical evidence and our ability to actually engage with reports like the Chernobyl Forum or the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation reports. You need a good knowledge of epidemiology and statistics and critical appraisal to be able to assess the validity of one competing bit of literature with another.
That's a really good insight. Thanks for pointing that out, because I had never ever considered that she was an older doctor rather than a younger doctor.
There's older doctors that have kept up with the literature and have educated themselves in the tools of evidence-based medicine, but it's a slog, man. That's a big part of medical training these days. Every week we would be doing critical appraisals of the medical literature and looking at these exact issues of, is the methodology sound? What's the quality of this study? What are the potential biases and flaws? That's something that I think scientists do and have done for a long time, but that is fairly new to medicine. Null hypothesis, scientific method thing where you're constantly assuming you're wrong and then sort of proving your way out of that. And that finally arrived at medicine, I'd say, in the early 2000s. So that's something that Dr. Caldicott is not as well versed in. And certainly, that's making a bold statement, but I'm basing that on, statements that she's made, which demonstrate a profound illiteracy in research methodology.
WHO says only 56 people died at Chernobyl. However, the New York Academy of Science has just, to its credit, translated 5,000 papers from Russian.
There was a Russian report. The author was the founder of Greenpeace in Russia, for instance. His report, although published in the National Academy of Sciences, was not endorsed by them whatsoever, was not peer-reviewed, and has been just decimated by experts in the fields. And essentially assuming that every excess death after the Chernobyl accident was due to radiation rather than the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of their health system, the rampant alcoholism that followed the economic collapse.
WHO says only 56 people died at Chernobyl.
Well, I think that E equals MC squared is a substitute probably for male, will I say it? Erection and ejaculation. And they like it. And it's this sort of energy that really grabs them.
I've just seen so much footage of anti-nuclear activists acting flat out crazy.
This is the biggest medical conspiracy and cover-up in the history of medicine, George.
And it doesn't seem to percolate through in the mainstream media.
He's either got a cerebral tumor or he's had a psychotic breakdown. That's my clinical diagnosis.
It's like they get cleaned up before anyone sees them.
It's like Donald Trump, the way he has been covered in the media, right? Like, they don't show all the gaffes. When they do the nightly news report, they'll actually show the 2% of the time he said something coherent. You were generally getting a bit of a cleaned up version. And the same is true, I think, for Helen Caldicott.
Well, they'll be dying of cancer, but they're not dying from lack of electricity. They might be sweating a bit in the summer. Oh, but you mustn't be too hot in the summer. That's what we've got sweat glands for.
As a doctor, you'd think that that would not be something she would say.
Do you want to have a competition? The idea that more people died from Chernobyl than the Black Death. I think that's probably the most inaccurate stat I've ever heard her drop.
Certainly, I think more people have died from Chernobyl than in the Black Plague. And this isn't being talked about either.
So there was a Green Festival in New York.
God damn them, I'm fed up with these physicists. I debate with them, and they're rude to me. And they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand genetics. They don't understand medicine. They don't understand anything, but they like this power.
That was another one where she showed the bogus follow-up map from Fukushima.
The wind was blowing from east to west, and it started covering your west coast. The ambient levels in Seattle went up 40,000 times above normal. Ambient levels of radiation. God knows how much cancer is going to occur.
You see people in the audience taking photos with their phone of the map she's projecting up on the screen.
Seaweed was so full of radioactive iodine, it was like nuclear waste. 6 days later, it's on your west coast. 10 days, it's engulfing you.
Helen Caldicott's always campaigning to shut down reactors in New York. There's Indian Point.
The pipes where am I? Indian Point are rusty, and they're extending its life for another 20 years. It's like extending my life for another 20 years. I'll be like this. Breaking my hips, getting pneumonia, and that's what's going to happen to those reactors. How dare they extend their lives?
And she was saying how she was in a boat with Bobby Kennedy.
We're building these all over the country, a tower, and surrounded by giant mirrors in the desert. Everybody is looking at gas as the supplementary fuel. The plants that we're building, the wind plants and the solar plants, are gas plants.
Musing about how they could drive into the water intake for the reactor, and they thought the reactor would explode or have a meltdown, right? So she wasn't saying they should do that, but it was just like, oh, we don't want a Timothy McVeigh doing this, so we should probably shut down Indian Point preemptively.
Yeah.
And that was cut.
I was outside those Indian Point reactors on Bobby Kennedy's boat. I could easily, if I'd been Timothy McVeigh, with fertilizer explosives, driven a boat into the cooling pipes and melted down the reactors within a couple of hours. And this book here, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, describes the meltdown at Indian Point.
They cut that out, and it's like, well, that was something that was so crazy, you don't want to include it in your online copy, right?
I did talk to people at Indian Point, and they said that sort of an attack would not result in a meltdown. They have other means of dealing with decay heat. Turn off the reactor, deal with the decay heat, you're fine. What would happen is the reactor would stop producing power.
There are only two elements that are fissionable, plutonium-239 and uranium-238.
On her visit to Canada, she was opining on Canadian uranium, and it's obvious really quickly she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Your uranium in Saskatchewan is so rich you don't even have to enrich it. It's extremely powerful.
And that is absolutely not true. Our reactors are better than many other reactors because we can use natural uranium in CANDU reactors. And I actually owe it to you, me having been a nuclear advocate since 2011.
You've helped raise my awareness of how
good CANDU reactors are. I assume they were sort of underpowered little weaklings because a long time ago I heard that a CANDU was used to heat a university, and it wasn't used to generate electricity, it was just heat.
You living in Ontario, you can attest that they can do so much more than just warm a university.
It's called the greatest greenhouse gas emissions reduction in North America, and no one is talking about it. Right? Like it's what was accomplished in Ontario is incredible, and it should be the blueprint for what we do in Alberta next, or what we do in Saskatchewan.
And people even in Ontario don't know it.
No, of course. I didn't know it until recently. I was at climate marches waving placards around and then going, wow, we've actually done a really good job here. We got more to do, don't get me wrong. But it goes to show the degree to which the cultural zeitgeist is so anti-nuclear, that the media is so anti-nuclear, that the whole kind of communications environment is so anti-nuclear that's not better known. I have a friend who said that growing up, they just never had the idea that unicorns didn't exist. They hadn't caught on to that. And so they just missed that at some point in their entire education. And they actually got to university and they were in their first year biology class and they were talking about, imaginary, weird and wonderful animals. And it was a shock to her that unicorns weren't real because she just never had that for whatever reason. Like, you think about like Swiss cheese model of life and just being able to, carry on with a belief like that. I started reading deeply about climate change and climate solutions in 2017, a bit late to the party there. I had that sort of, that moment of unicorn shock where I was like, Ontario is 65% powered by nuclear energy. We weren't always that way. We had 25% of our electricity produced by coal up until the early 2000s. Really, it was nuclear energy that got coal off the grid, displacing that enormous amount of generation with nuclear through the CANDU reactor, which is a source that, again, produces no air pollution and very, very, very low levels of CO2 emissions. I've just grown to appreciate the CANDU in the sense that our nuclear history is just incredible in terms of achieving a criticality event and then designing a reactor that could face the challenges that Canada did in terms of not having uranium enrichment capacities or heavy forging. So Canadians designed a reactor that could use natural uranium, and with our pressure tube design was able to get around the need for heavy forging industry. Kind of analogous to like the Avro Aero story, where you don't want to see an amazing Canadian design, go down the tubes.
Another thing you raised my awareness of was the CANDU supply chain. Maybe non-Canadians want to skip ahead for a minute. I took some notes. I want to talk about this Canadian to Canadian. I think we can assume any small modular reactor pilot plant built in Canada will have an almost exclusively Canadian supply chain. The whole concept of small modular reactors is factory fabrication. Whatever country hosts the pilot, they kind of get dibs on that supply chain. But on your podcast, it was claimed CANDU already have an almost exclusively Canadian supply chain. And that kind of blew my mind to hear that, because a lot of nuclear news I consume comes from the United States, and they don't do heavy forging anymore. On top of me making my own lazy assumptions, when I was Googling about the economic impact of small modular reactors, I find the Watershed Sentinel directly regurgitating anti-nuclear talking points from CELA, the Canadian Environmental Law Association. So the part I'm going to focus on is jobs, and CELA cites an American study. The only thing American and Canadian low-carbon energy jobs have in common is that building nuclear plants push domestic technology forward. A job installing solar panels or cleaning wind turbines does not. But what's so different is that the US manufactures wind turbines when Canada imports ours. Nuclear is the opposite. The CANDU supply chain has always been a Canadian supply chain. CANDU was designed to be built, maintained, and fueled by Canadians. So that study CELA cites is inapplicable to Canadians. I don't know why they cited it. I don't know why Watershed Sentinel didn't look at the study itself before quoting CELA, except to say it's pretty obvious that's an anti-nuclear news outlet regurgitating an anti-nuclear organization. And that's the same kind of circle jerk I see with Dr. Helen Caldicott and Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik. And I do think the reason Russian propaganda outlets are happy to run stories by Dr. Helen Caldicott about how terrible nuclear power is because Germans' solar and wind is backed up by coal, and is backed up by biomass, and it's backed up by Russian natural gas. Okay, that's the end of my rant. We'll have a conversation now. So one other thing anyone watching this can do if you live in Canada is head to c4ne.ca. That's Canadians for Nuclear Energy.Canada, and that will bring you to a call to action. You definitely will accomplish something very important if you head there. We'll just redirect it to whatever the latest call to action. If you're hearing this a year from now, it's still going to be something you can do.
And luckily, we're refurbishing so many of our CANDU reactors. They're going to continue to do the great work they've been doing up until the 2060s and hopefully beyond. And it is funny, I talk to pro-nuclear advocates around the world, and they say, really, I should be saying that the AP1000 is kind of the reactor that I am behind. But they're like, but really, I like the CANDU. You guys have got a good thing going on up there. So it's interesting. I mean, I've heard this from a number of people now.
Am I correct in thinking that the US is helping finance a CANDU reactor being built in Romania?
Yes, in broad terms, you're right on that. There were CANDU reactors that they started building in Romania, and there's a U.S. development bank that has decided to finance finishing these reactors, and they are CANDU. So it is really momentous that the U.S., for whatever geopolitical reason, is helping to build a Canadian technology, which will actually have a lot of benefits to Canada Tech. We have the IP, and we have the most experience building these things and refurbishing them.
What would it be like to actually build a new CANDU at this point in time? Because we haven't built CANDUs in Canada lately.
There's been at least 25, maybe 27 years since the last new CANDU was brought online in Canada. There have been CANDU builds in China like in early 2000s. This was something that surprised me recently. I was talking with someone and they said Canada has the healthiest nuclear industry in the West. Right? And you say, what? How can that be? We haven't built a new reactor in almost 30 years. Like, that's insane. But a $26 billion investment has just been made in refurbishing most of the CANDU reactors that we have in this country, which essentially means you have this concrete skeleton of the building, but you're swapping out all of the components that can wear down on a reactor, right? So all those components of the reactor that have wear and tear. So you essentially have a new CANDU reactor inside of the same containment building and infrastructure and transmission infrastructure. So we're much more ready to build a new CANDU in my mind than another advanced design at this point, given that we have a supply chain now that we've ramped up refurbing, I think around 12 reactors by the late 2020s. I would think that we'd be tooled and ready to go if we wanted to build a new CANDU. I think the issue is that existing nuclear isn't sexy, right? Advanced nuclear that hasn't tasted some of the challenges of existing in real life is really easy to get behind. And I just think that we need to reevaluate some of our biases. And yes, the CANDU is based upon technology that was, created in the 50s and 60s. I mean, all nuclear technology is based on, designs and ideas that came out of that time period. But for me, as an advocate, particularly concerned about climate change, I want the goal to be very clear, that we get to zero emissions as quickly as possible and hopefully even negative emissions, and that we choose the best way to get there, right? And I'm usually a very kind of radical person with a lot of zany ideas. I find myself to be very conservative in terms of how I'm approaching nuclear in this sense. And I'm saying, listen, guys, like we have this design, we know how it works. We have a regulatory agency that's specialized in this. We've built a lot of momentum with, 12 CANDU refurbishments. The next logical and the safest step and the most likely to be on budget and on time would be to build another CANDU in my mind. I am not an expert, and I really look forward to being schooled on this by people who hold different opinions. But that's kind of where I'm settling in at right now in terms of my take on CANDU.
I think it would be quite easy to convince a majority of Canadians that we should be building nuclear reactors in Alberta, in Canada. And it kind of comes from the notion that the more people are educated about nuclear power, the less they fear it. First of all, in the States, the Democrats made huge gains in the last 3 years in terms of supporting nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of hard to fathom how such a big increase would have happened. And the Republicans did move a notch. And that's even with Donald Trump doing a little bit of lip service.
We will begin to revive and expand our nuclear energy sector, which I'm so happy about, which produces clean, renewable, and emissions-free energy.
Democrats are the party of climate concern. They need to have a change in their position, right? It's the logical thing. They need to be looking at all options.
I remember the intensity of the nuclear debate when I first started in the environment back in 1970 in the first Earth Day. And I was on the other side of it then. But given this challenge we face today, and given the progress of fourth generation nuclear, go for it. No other alternative, zero emissions.
Whereas the Republicans, I think their reasons for supporting nuclear are, pretty status quo. That's not changing for them. Climate's not really changing the metric for them, at least not until now. I think hopefully it will. And I think the Conservatives in Canada as well are learning they need to have answers on climate change. Like the Canadian Conservatives will not win the 905 unless they can have some answers for what their climate plan is.
The other poll that I thought was fascinating was Canadians view Germany as a climate leader, and they're not. And they think France is not a climate leader. Mm-hmm. And they are.
I've just been in Germany and Austria, and lots of the little farmhouses now are covered in solar panels. Germany's moving fast with renewables.
Renewables have been branded as very clean, very sexy. There's this naturalistic fallacy. If something comes from nature, then we accept it and we think it's good. Of course, the phenomena of photons arriving and of winds accumulating is natural and wonderful and beautiful. But the harvesters themselves are incredibly material intensive. They're not natural. It's amazing to me that they kind of fit into a landscape and that people are not kind of grossed out by them. Enormous steel pylons jutting up with these huge fiberglass blades spinning. Like that doesn't fit into an environment. It changes it. It industrializes it. But the branding and the marketing has been so successful that yes, a country like Germany can be seen and perceived in that way, despite the underlying numbers being in such stark contrast.
Bird-resistant wind turbines, which would be okay. So it's a thing that finally acknowledging that yes, maybe wind turbines are killing some birds. If you have one of the blades a different color, then that helps the birds avoid the blades. So There you go. We now have bird-resistant wind turbines as a brand that you will not see adopted because those guys know how to brand.
Yes, exactly.
The vocabulary of nuclear power seems bad. For example, a nuclear poison is what absorbs a neutron that you would rather be using for fission.
Accident tolerant fuel is a product being promoted by the Department of Energy in the United States.
Yeah.
And I can't think of an analogy for accident tolerant fuel in any other industry. Like everything runs off fuel, basically. Natural gas has an odor added to it so that you're aware that it's leaking in your house. I haven't heard of a catchy name for that. That would terrify people.
Explosion avoiding smelly gas. It's a very good question. No, there's a lot of the industry shooting itself in its foot, unfortunately. And it's very strange for me to be saying this. I mean, talking about an industry and the need for an industry is a very foreign concept to me, right? I mean, I don't think of the healthcare system as an industry per se, right? I mean, I think maybe it's described that way, particularly in more privatized contexts, as, the healthcare industry. It feels kind of gross and off color to me because, health is a human right, and as is healthcare. I am seeing these big overlaps, between healthcare and energy and water and basically other essential services, right? Like when it's minus 30 outside, even if you've in arrears on your hydro bill, our society is set up in such a way that we don't cut off your hydro because your kids are going to freeze or, something terrible is going to happen. And so when we're dealing with these kind of problems, there's this kind of veneer of when you say industry that just feels dirty. And I'm not sure if that's another kind of marketing problem, but in any case, I'm just saying that not in a million years as a refugee rights activist or, some of the other political work I've done, would I have been fighting alongside or kind of with an industry. It seems very, very strange, and in terms of my own politics, like so much of it has to do with like just distribution of goods, right? That we don't leave anybody behind and that there's a, basic standard that everyone is held up to so that everyone can achieve their full potential. I mean, that's kind of the cheesy version of my politics, that human beings should flourish and that we should create the social conditions for everybody, whatever their genetic blueprint, to come into this world and to be all they can be and to achieve all they can achieve. But learning about climate and learning about some of the environmental challenges we face, it's not all about just redistribution of resources. We have to make the right decisions about which technologies we employ, because some of those choices are going to have big environmental and social benefits, and some will have drawbacks and harms. And so as a progressive political activist, starting to now spend most of my energy advocating for technology feels very foreign, but in the context of a climate emergency, it's the logical thing. So I embrace that kind of cognitive dissonance of like, what am I doing? Why am I kind of advocating for a technology or for an industry? I'm not industry associated. I'm not paid by industry. I want nothing to do with that. But I have recognized that nuclear is a technology, and it really is the only scalable, ultra low emissions technology capable of achieving deep decarbonization and emitting no air pollution and providing people with the energy they need so that we can all flourish and, as cheesy as it sounds, kind of be the best versions of ourselves that we can be.
Think about Brett's Open 100 proposal in Calgary, and I can't speak to the viability, but one of the images was a park built on top of the nuclear reactor. That kind of stuck with me. And the next reactor that gets built, I would hope that it is a visitor center and that it can drive a lot of people through it to see it.
In France, up until the 90s, basically every high school class would visit a nuclear plant and, learn about it and be exposed to the technology. What you've really seen in the last 30 years is public opinion has shifted. There's so much more ignorance. Pollsters that have looked at the French population, what their perception of nuclear is regarding climate change, and a majority of people under 40 believe that what's coming out of those stacks is CO2, not water. No, you laugh, but I mean that's like the direct consequence of cutting off those high school visits. That's the way you immunize the population from scientific illiteracy, and not just in that sense. I mean, they should go to vaccine labs as well. They should.
Yeah, that's true.
It's interesting talking with Seaver Wang from the Breakthrough Institute about attitudes towards technology in China. In China, there's this huge sense of national pride this is a civilization that's sort of been in a continuous state of operation for 5,000 years and invented many, many things before the West did in terms of gunpowder and paper and other things. And there's a narrative there that like technology is amazing. We should embrace it. We should have a more optimistic view towards it. Whereas in the West, I think we've become really obsessed with the precautionary principle. You should be critically thinking your way through the implications of a new technology. But, the way that we're applying the precautionary principle in the West to things like genetic engineering, for instance, it would have eliminated the possibility of so many other advances in the 20th century, like antibiotics or aviation or, all of the arguments that are made to suppress new and emerging technologies that are really exciting. It reflects this kind of profound unease that we seem to have now in the West towards the future, optimism, and the tools we'll need to kind of navigate the challenges we face.
I was in Shanghai for a thorium conference. I was doing the man on the street interviews about nuclear power. Nobody was against nuclear power. Now, granted, this is people who would speak to me in English, right?
Right.
So these are kind of educated students and they probably have a little bit of guts. But it's like everyone was pro-nuclear there. They cited the kind of thing I would cite if the sun goes down. So what's a solar panel going to do?
Maybe China's going a little fast, but also the Chinese government is acutely aware of its pollution. It doesn't like nuclear power.
Nuclear energy is a kind of energy. It is safe.
People of the city make the life better.
The oil and the coal is limited source.
We had better not to use the coal.
Industry cannot get much energy from the sun.
China is a big country, and so nuclear power is necessary.
So that conference was in 2012, shortly after China said they were going to build a thorium reactor. And late 2020, China announces they're assembling it from already fabricated parts. At pretty much the exact same moment, the US DOE kind of lets it slip that they're not going to fund any thorium research for their domestic market. I don't know why China and the US see this technology so differently, but China isn't just building a reactor in an industrial complex, they're building a campus.
I went to McMaster University for my medical degree, and McMaster has a nuclear engineering program and a small learning reactor. So there's this mini little containment dome on campus, 20 feet in diameter and maybe 20 feet high. But I remember just being shocked that this thing was on campus and outraged even, right? And like, maybe I should like lead a protest, or maybe we should put some graffiti on here pointing out like this horrible thing on our campus. And I mean, that was, in the first days of my medical training. And I think that's also something that helped immunize me as well around radiophobia and understanding relative risks was my medical education and seeing cobalt-60, which is a really important gamma radiation source for sterilizing surgical instruments. And this year we made enough cobalt-60 in our reactors, in our CANDU reactors, to sterilize 20 billion pieces of PPE, with a B, billion, right? Wow. And we do 40% of the world's single-use surgical instruments are sterilized with cobalt-60 from CANDU reactors. So we're not the only producers of that isotope, but it is a design feature of CANDU that allows us to do that in terms of, putting an isotope in and deciding how long you're going to cook it for. I could imagine an advanced reactor company being like, hey, we can make these amazing isotopes. And people would be like, whoa, advanced, new, cool. There's a lot that we take for granted in our existing designs.
That is actually what excites me the most about molten salt reactors, just the possibility of extracting stuff from the spent fuel. You can harvest all these isotopes. I do kind of think that is one of the keys to nuclear communication. Now, it's not like they're going to invent a new medical isotope, but the practicality, making these things practical to obtain, it changes how you use them, right? Like the unobtainium in Avatar.
This is why we're here. Unobtainium.
I didn't know that was an actual term engineers use to be like, this is something that we need, but it's just too expensive. So call it unobtainium. Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. I'm going to kill it now.
My pleasure, Gordon. Thanks for making it happen.